Welcome everybody to another episode of In Leader's Mind. My name is Tomas Tomasevic. I am, as you know, building another Vistage group. It's a CEO peer-to-peer group, and in that process, I'm trying to share the wealth of the types of discussions and type of topics that we normally cover in our meetings. Today, I have David Friedman with me. We're going to be talking about culture and the importance of culture. David is one of the famous speakers from Vistage, and instead of me spoiling it, David, why don't you tell us a few things about yourself?
Sure. So I am a speaker that does present to Vistage groups, but quick little background for your audience. So I'm in the Philadelphia area. I spent 27 years building a company that was very successful, sold the company, retired from that industry, and ended up writing a book about the things we had done. All of our success in our company was based on the culture that we had built. And I learned some things as the CEO of how to do that. Wrote my first book. That book got me introduced into the Vistage world. Somebody who, a former client of my old company, happened to be in a Vistage group and read my book and said, "You should speak to our Vistage group." And I, like perhaps some of your audience, I didn't know what Vistage was. And he hooked me up with the chair, a guy like you, and the chair asked me to speak to their group. And next thing I knew, I was speaking to lots of Vistage groups. So last week was my 591st talk to a Vistage group. I was in Dallas last week. So I have spoken to many, many Vistage groups. And certainly my experience is that Vistage members all across the country speak so highly of the value of their Vistage experience. It's a model that works.
And speakers like this make us, give us that authority, or should I say that recognition. So thank you for finding time today. I see some culture words behind you. Can you tell us about what does that represent?
Yeah, so my company is called CultureWise, and so there's a little logo behind me. But what I talk about is culture, but I guess what makes me different than everybody else who talks about culture or writes about culture is I'm often seen as the practical guy, that so often conversations about culture end up being very esoteric or very fluffy. And we all kind of know it's important. It's not that anybody disagrees with that, but okay, yeah, I know it. Yeah, it's important. Now what? What do I do? And what I teach people is, okay, if we understand it's important, how do we go back to our companies and do something about it? How do you execute upon it? And that's what I teach people.
So let's hear about the more structured
All right, so how do we do that?
Yes.
So I organize the steps that it takes to be really systematic, to have a process around this, around a model that I created many years ago. I call it the 8-step framework. 8 different things. When we do these 8 things together, this is the model that enables us to really be systematic about our culture. And yet, while all of the 8 steps are important, at the end of the day, if we really cut to the chase, there are 2 steps that drive most of the impact. If you do these 2 things well, you will be very successful. And if you don't do these 2 things well, you won't get very far. So let me identify for your audience those 2 things. The first of those 2 things, and I'll say to you right up front, these are so simple and they're so obvious, except people haven't really thought of it this way. So this isn't some magic, wand or formula. This is really obvious stuff, but usually the most powerful things are pretty obvious. So the first of those 2 steps is that we've got to be able to define what we want our culture to be with far more clarity than most people do. Mm-hmm. So the reason I say this is obvious and critical is that how could we go about creating a specific culture if you can't tell me with enough clarity, well, what is it that we're trying to create? Now, again, that sounds simple, and yet very few companies do it well. Now, almost every one of your listeners, viewers, audience will probably at some point in their leadership career has gone through an exercise where they developed the typical vision, mission, and set of core values. And I will explain to you in a moment why that usually isn't sufficient. We go through these exercises and we brainstorm and we put Post-it notes on the walls, and then we spend a bunch of time crafting statements, and then we put it on the website, and then we get back to work and forget about it. And they're not all that useful most of the time. When I teach people how to define their culture, I make a really big deal about a specific language distinction that may at first sound like semantics, but is really actually important. Let me explain it. So I make a big deal about the distinction or the difference between what I would call core values and what I would call behaviors, because I think they're different from each other. And let me explain what that difference is and why this is relevant. So a value to me is typically an abstract concept: quality, integrity, loyalty, service, respect, teamwork, innovation. These are ideas. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something that I can literally observe people doing. So some of the behaviors that I teach in my own company as examples are things like honor commitments. That's something you do. Practice blameless problem solving. Get clear on expectations. Be a fanatic about response time. Listen generously. These are actions that people do. So a value is typically an abstract concept, a behavior is an action. The reason that that distinction is more than just semantics is that the problem with the typical core values is that they're so broad and nebulous that they mean too many different things to different people, and they therefore become hard to operationalize. So I'll give you a really simple example. One of the core values that I see in many organizations is they'll have the value for respect. Sounds like a perfectly good thing. Who would argue with that? But what does that word mean? It means a lot of different things to different people. If you grew up in an inner city gang, your definition of what it looks like to respect somebody or to diss them could be very different from yours. An example I think of often is, I think about regional differences. If you grew up in the southern part of the United States in the Bible Belt, you would have been raised as a child and taught that when you speak to an adult, you call them sir or ma'am, because it's disrespectful not to do that. If you do that in the Northeast where I live, it's just weird. It has nothing to do with respect at all. We just have different norms. So to simply say we value respect, great. I just don't know that's all that helpful for us. We may truly believe in it, but we all have different ideas of what it means. Behaviors, because they're so much more action oriented, are much easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. If for any of your CEOs that had this experience, it is very difficult to coach somebody about their values. That's hard to do. But I could coach people all day long about what I see them doing or not doing. So behaviors become way easier to operationalize. So I teach companies to define their culture, not necessarily in terms of that big, broad set of lofty values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, if we could get our people to do these things, wow, we would be an amazing company if we could do these more consistently, let's say. And I give those behaviors a name. It's just my own nomenclature. I call them fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So in sports, music, other areas, we have fundamentals. Same thing here. There are fundamentals for the way we operate in this company. So the first step in the process is to bring way more clarity to what we want our culture to be by defining a set of behaviors or fundamentals that this is what we want our culture to be. That makes sense?
It does. Sure does.
All right. Now, once we have that, the second step is the game changer, and it's equally simple. The second step is what I call creating rituals. So a ritual to me is some routine, a habit, something we do all the time. You go to a ball game, we start with the national anthem. Some people before a meal, they say a prayer. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth. They're just routines. The reason that routines or rituals are so critical to success is that most people and most companies are not very good at sticking with things. We come up with all kinds of great ideas and they all sound wonderful, and then we get busy and they fall by the wayside and they become either the latest New Year's resolution that didn't last till February, or they become the flavor of the month at work and they don't last. When something becomes a ritual, it's not hard to do. It's just what we do. It's just part of our routine. So we don't struggle in the morning to remember to brush our teeth. It's just part of the routine. So here's the simple concept. If we could take those behaviors, those fundamentals, and roll it out to people, get everybody engaged in them, and then begin to focus and teach and practice them through a series of rituals, and I'll show you an example in just a moment, now it's got a chance to last for years and years into the future because its continuity, its sustainability isn't dependent upon you somehow developing a level of discipline you've never shown before. Instead, it's the ritual, the routine that keeps it going. So let me give you a simple example. In my company, and pretty much all the companies that I teach, one of the rituals that we create is that every meeting in my company starts with the first agenda item of every single meeting, whether it's a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting. The first agenda item is what we call the fundamental of the week. So we take our fundamentals, those behaviors, everybody gets engaged in them, and then we focus on one every week. So week number one, all week long, everybody in the company is focused on number one. Next week, everybody's on number two, and the week after 3 and 4 and 5, and we just keep cycling through them. So my company's fundamental this week is one that we call get clear on expectations. I teach people that, we judge situations not by what happens, but how it compared to what we thought was going to happen. If I was giving the example this morning to somebody that I was on a flight last week from Dallas to Philadelphia, and we were supposed to land at 2:30 and we got in at 2:05, and everybody was thrilled. If we were supposed to land at 1:45 and we got in 2:05, we'd be frustrated. So the 2:05 isn't important. What's important is, how did 2:05 compare to what we were expecting to happen? And this is true in every interaction everywhere, that misunderstandings come from, I thought one thing, you thought something else, and that's why we missed each other. So if we could all get really clear and make sure in every conversation, everybody's on the same page, we're going to be way more effective as a company. That's my fundamental this week. So every meeting in my company, every type of meeting all week long, the first 3 to 5 minutes we spend talking about getting clear on expectations. How could we be better at? What gets in the way? Was there a good example where we did or didn't do it yesterday? And we just spend a few minutes and then we move on. We don't want to take over the meeting. So every meeting we're doing that. So think about your companies, and think about all the meetings that take place in your company this week in every location. And imagine if in every one of them, people spent a few minutes talking about this week's fundamental. That's a lot of chances to teach that principle. And if we do the same thing next week and the week after and the week after, and we just keep cycling through them, sooner or later, these behaviors start to become second nature to people. So there are a lot of different rituals that companies create. That's just an example of one. But the simple idea here is, if we can define in really clear terms those behaviors that most drive success in your company, and then we can create a structured, systematic way to teach those behaviors to people over and over and over and over and over and over again, sooner or later, those behaviors are going to become internalized in the people.
Very good.
That's pretty simple. And all I've done is develop a methodology to do that. So the other 6 steps in that 8-step framework relate to things like, how do we hire the right people who are going to be a fit for our culture? How do we integrate or onboard them? How do we coach them? How do we create accountability for it? So there are other things, but the core of it is this very simple concept that if we can define with more clarity exactly the behaviors that drive success, and then we can create a structured way to teach those over and over and over again, those behaviors are going to become internalized in our people and just become second nature to us. And now we really have a process around our culture. Pretty simple.
I love it. It is simple and it's very powerful. How many, out of curiosity, how many behaviors do companies typically define?
Yeah, that's a great question, Thomas, and it will be my answer will surprise you and your audience. So the first thing I would say is, it doesn't matter. Whatever they got, they got. But having said that, I've done this process. I've brought more than 400 companies through this process. Believe it or not, the least number of behaviors I've ever seen is 18.
Okay.
The most I've ever seen is 40.
Wow.
The sweet spot usually ends up in the 25 to 30 area. I will tell you that virtually every one of those companies began the process by saying, I don't want to have any more than like 5, because you understand, this won't work for our people. And none of those companies, this is 400 companies, so none of them are saying that today. The conventional wisdom for why we should only have 3, 4, 5 things, it's certainly no more than 6, is because people can't remember more than that, right? And you're right, they can't. But here's the question I always ask. What's our goal? Is our goal to have something that our people can recite, or is our goal to have our people live the behaviors that drive success in our company? I think it's the latter. And there's more
Absolutely.
than 5 behaviors that drive success. In fact, I happen to have 30 in my company. If I showed you my 30, I would ask you, and you only want to have 5, I would ask, which 25 of these do you don't think are important enough to teach in your company? You'd have to give up a lot of things. Ultimately, the reason that the number doesn't matter is because whether you have 3 or 11 or 17 or 26, we're only going to focus on one at a time. And we're going to keep cycling through them over and over and over again. So it doesn't really, outside, there is an outer limit. If you had 300 of them, we'd never get back to the beginning. But outside of something silly, the number doesn't really matter. And we're not walking up to somebody saying, Thomas, can you recite number 11? No, I don't need anybody to recite anything. I just know that if we take them one at a time and we focus on it intently and we keep cycling through them over and over, sooner or later, they're going to become second nature. That's why the number doesn't matter. It's counterintuitive, but once you understand how we're using it, you see why it's just not a big deal. So it always surprises people until they get it.
Understood. And the one that you mentioned, which was blameless problem solving.
Yeah.
I like that one very much. Of course, I have heard only one out of many.
Yes.
And that one gave me heebie-jeebies in a sense that I would love to be able to bring that into many companies I work with, including my company.
Yes.
So there's lots of value. Can you give me another one that is maybe a little bit more esoteric that you find interesting for discussion?
Well, I would say, so if I were to think of the ones that are the most common, that are in every company. So that's one in every company because it's so important. The one I mentioned for us this week, get clear on expectations, is one you might not have thought of, and yet it's absolutely essential to get good at that. Here's one that everybody would agree with, but most people don't practice it well. And I call it honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. And so I'll tell you that fundamentals on their surface, there's so many examples I can give you, but let me say this, that fundamentals on their surface always sound simple, and yet there's so much depth and nuance to them. So let's just unpack a little bit honoring commitments. So the single biggest reason in my experience that people fail to honor their commitments is they make commitments they shouldn't. They say yes to things that because we want to satisfy the customer, we want to please our boss, when they can't be done. And they figure, hey, as long as I try my best, that's good enough. But then we end up in this dysfunctional relationship where I don't know what to count on. Imagine a world where every time somebody said to you, Thomas, I will have this to you by Wednesday at 3 o'clock, and you knew with absolute certainty that that would absolutely be done, how much more effective would we be as a company? But instead, we make promises all over the place, and some of them we do, and some we don't, and some we're late, and some we tried our hardest. And there's just this sloppiness in how we relate to each other, and it leads to dysfunction. And so it sounds like such a simple thing. Like nobody would disagree with that you should do what you say you're going to do, but most of the time we don't. What about commitments others make on our behalf without checking with us first? What about the things that we're dependent upon other people to do so we can fulfill our commitment? There's so much to that that you might not think of. I'll give you just one more just simple example of one that people would not see typically beneath the surface. There's a fundamental in my company, a lot of our clients, that is one of my favorites. Of course, I'm accused of saying this is one of my favorites about nearly all of them. But one of them is one I call check the ego at the door. And I say often that in my observation, the single biggest cause of dysfunction in most organizations is ego, is when people are more worried about who got credit, who got blamed, who looked good, who looked bad, instead of just how do we solve the problem. And everybody would agree with that. And yet many people, when they hear that, check the ego at the door, think of it, what's in their mind is they're picturing the guy or the woman with the big ego. Oh, I hate that salesperson that they got this big ego and they're a pain in the neck. But it's much more subtle than that. For example, why are we sometimes hesitant to ask for help? Because I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to look like I'm incompetent. Well, that's our ego getting in the way. I'm more worried about how I look than whether maybe asking for help would help solve this problem way better and way faster. But I don't want to look stupid. I'll be a little embarrassed, so I won't say anything. That's our ego getting in the way. Or sometimes when we're debating a topic and somebody is defending their point of view, that's their ego that's in the way. They're not worried about the idea. They're worried about how they look in the situation. And so that's the ego getting in the way. When we take things personally, as if it was about us, that's our ego getting in the way. There are so many different places in which our ego shows up that we don't think about. And I often say that it's interesting, in my experience, the people with the strongest, healthiest egos have the easiest time checking in at the door. Because if I'm secure in myself, I don't have to do things to make myself look good because I'm not worried about that. If I'm insecure in my ego, I make moves to bolster my ego to look good in front of others because I'm not as confident. So it's a little opposite of what you might think.
Oh, yeah.
So there are so many, I use that as just one example, two examples of the levels of depth and nuance and subtlety in each of these that we could talk about endlessly. And the more people are talking about these and exploring them and living them, the more effective our company becomes.
Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, any one of these topics that you have brought up, any one of these little rules of behavior, if you will, can be a discussion that can cover a Vistage meeting.
It probably could. They're so big.
Well, I mean,
so the system that I created, it just creates a mechanism, a platform for us to dialogue about that. In the absence of, let's say, talking about it in every single meeting, when do we talk about these?
Got it.
Here, we're creating a structure to dialogue about them and learn and internalize them.
On whom does it fall to make this routine live?
The CEO.
Okay.
Ultimately, the CEO is the chief cultural officer of the company.
Yep. Do you believe that CEOs can stand behind and embody every one of the 40 or 18 or whatever the number may be values that they find useful to their company?
What I would say, Thomas, is that as CEOs, as leaders, we need to be excellent examples of what we're promoting. Now, that doesn't mean we're perfect. And in fact, I'm sure you've seen this, in many cases, my ability to be vulnerable, which we talk a lot about in Vistage, my ability to be vulnerable and to acknowledge my shortcomings is often a great example of leadership, even a stronger example.
Absolutely.
So, simple example, we talked about blameless problem solving. If I had a situation in which I got all caught up in blame, I got all frustrated and angry, and I was saying, Thomas, I can't believe you did that. And I come back tomorrow and I say, Thomas, I got to tell you, I want to apologize that, we talk about blameless problem solving around here, and I was just in the moment so heated that I got myself all caught up in blame. That's not what we want to do here. It's something I'm working on. That's sometimes a great example of leadership, when I can acknowledge when I'm as vulnerable as you are, and we're all working on this together. Now, if I keep doing that repeatedly, at some point I'm going to lose credibility. But I don't have to be perfect. I got to be a good example, and I got to be working on it and show that we're all together in this. I'm like you. We're all working together as leaders and as rank and file, that we're trying to be the best we can, and we all have to coach and support each other to help be that way better.
So what have you seen that people do to make sure that this thing sticks sooner, so that the mass starts engaging and the whole company starts acting and enforcing, if you will, all of these rules?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, how this gets rolled out or introduced into the organization is critical. So if we were to create a set of, as I call them, fundamentals, and just say, okay, here we go, let's start, but they don't know, well, what is this? What do we do? Why are we doing this? It's not going to go as far. So what I have found over time is that when it's rolled out properly, and I've developed a method to do that, that involves engaged interactive activities with all the employees. So when it gets introduced, all employees go through a 3-hour, I call it a rollout, where we do these activities and exercises that engage them and get them talking about and participating, and gives it the context and the way that we want them to see it. Now, following that, we're ready to start practicing this in a more meaningful way. If we skip that step, we're at risk. One of the things we talk about in that rollout is what we were just discussing, is we never want to use our fundamentals, our behaviors, as a club to catch each other falling short. See, I saw Thomas, he didn't do it. That we always want to use this as a coaching opportunity for everybody, that we're working at this, we're trying to be the best we can. And when we fall short, as we inevitably will, then we coach and support and help each other to be this way more consistently. So that removes the pressure of feeling like, I got to be perfect. Oh my God, I'm feeling so much pressure about this. No, I got to be the best I can be, and I got to be working on it like we're all working on it. And in fact, it's easier for me to work on it if we're all supporting each other. So if I don't feel like I'm being judged by others, but rather I'm being supported by others, it creates an environment in which it's safe and helpful for me to practice and to work on it and to coach and to ask others for coaching and support. That's much less pressure and way more effective.
Love it. Love it. And it basically brings us to that previous statement that you have made, and that is check your ego at the door.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So in a sense, I'm catching here myself that perhaps me modeling
Yes.
some perfect behavior actually had to do more with my ego than with the true intent.
Exactly.
Where if we are all acknowledging that we need to learn, that we need to improve and whatnot, the ego and modeling becomes something that we learn, not something that we have to be perfect at.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a real good observation.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So how long does it take a company to, of course, with your guidance and proper implementation, create these things so that it is a true ritual?
It's very fast, way faster than people think.
Really?
So in the way that I've evolved this over time, so again, the concepts here are so generic and simple. And all I've done is create a methodology for how do you create the fundamentals? How do you roll it out effectively? How do you start practicing to make this easy to do? So depending upon the size of the company, in a smaller company, it's usually from starting to rolling it out and starting to practice every week is usually about 30 days. In a larger company, depending upon how many people and locations they have, it could be 60 or 90 days. So this is not a 3-year program that's going to take everybody's management attention and, oh my God, how can we take on this big initiative? We've done this for very large companies in 60 days or less. And they start seeing impact virtually immediately. So it's just not hard to do when you've got it down to a science.
What kind of results do people get?
You know, it's interesting. They, first of all, I would say as a general comment, many of our clients say that this is the single most impactful thing they've done in the history of their company. And what's interesting when I make that statement is that most of the people that I have worked with, their starting point was, it was already a really good company. And the reason for that, just as a side comment here, and this will make sense to you and your audience, is that my experience is if I see a company that's completely messed up and totally dysfunctional, unless it's the case that a new CEO just came in and that's what they inherited. But if I'm a CEO and I've been running this company for years and it's completely dysfunctional, it's because I don't think culture is important. And if I don't think it's important, I'm not going to spend any time, effort, or resources working on it. So the only people who work on their culture for the most part are people who think it's important. Otherwise, they wouldn't work on it. And if they think it's important, they have been intuitively, naturally doing many of the right things. They do care about their people in a genuine way. It matters to them to have highly functioning group of people. So naturally, they've been doing a lot of good things. It's just that they've never been systematic about it. And now they want to be systematic. So having said that, that's the starting point. Many of them will say this is the most impactful thing they've ever done in the history of their company. What are the impacts they see? Number of things. They'll see increased productivity. They'll certainly see lower turnover. They'll see an increased ability to hire the best people because people want to work there. So when they're competing to hire employees, they get the first choice because people want to be part of that company. Most of them will see increased profitability. They'll see better customer service. They'll see employees who are more fully engaged. They'll see people who work better as teammates and less siloed kind of environments because people are more collaborative with each other. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, one of the things that people will see the most, I did some surveying of our clients once to ask about the things they see most. And And I also, on my website, we've got like testimonials of something like 75 different clients talking about the impact of this work. And if I sift through those and I look for the common denominators, the single most common thing that people will mention isn't something you might have thought of, but it'll make sense when I say it. People will almost always say that they never imagined how powerful having a common language is.
Oh, yeah.
That, in the absence of a common language, people get frustrated with each other. When we all say, remember, we have to practice blameless problem solving. Hey, remember, I got to speak straight right now. I need you to be a generous listener. And we're all using the same language. The impact of that is really significant. And it's not something people think about in advance, but afterwards they say, wow, that really changed my company. It even makes coaching conversations different. In the absence of a common language, when I'm giving you some feedback, you often feel attacked. How come that guy's always picking on me? If instead of picking on you, I talk about, remember, Thomas, one of the things we talk about a lot around here is honoring commitments. So let's talk about, what does that look like in this situation? Now the coaching conversation is about the principle that we've all agreed to versus it being about you and me and our conflict. And so there's tremendous power to having a common language.
That's the unit that we need to develop, that oftentimes we do not develop fully in the organization. You did not surprise me specifically with this statement about the common language, and that probably has to do with my area of expertise as well. But one of the things that I have seen, that when it comes down to managing employees and implementing psychometric means of understanding personality of people, a common language makes it so that we are discussing issues, we're discussing opportunities, we're not personalizing it. Consequently, we can easily get to the solutions without getting into you did, I did, he did.
Exactly.
Right? So this is exciting. So short of joining my group and waiting for you to become our speaker, which will happen in my other groups very soon, how else can people learn more about this stuff that you're learning, that you're talking about?
Yeah, so a number of ways. So 2 websites to check out. My company website is culturewise.com. My personal website is davidjfriedman, Friedman.com. So there's a lot of information there. I have several books, and they're on Amazon and they're on Audible. So if people like listening to books, I do the audio for them. The 2 main books are my first book was called Fundamentally Different. So if you look on Amazon for Fundamentally Different, my second book was called Culture by Design. And it really gives, the description I was giving you of how do you do this. It's interesting. When I wrote Fundamentally Different, it was written about my original company's culture and the fundamentals that we practiced. I didn't write that book as a how-to book, though many people kind of read it that way. Culture by Design is the how-to book. This is how you do it. This is the steps. Go through, I describe the exact process. And when people look up that book, Culture by Design, you'll see there's 2 editions of it. The second edition includes everything in the first, but I updated it to include the remote and hybrid work environment and how to adapt these ideas to that. So if you see 2 versions, it's edition 1 and edition 2, but edition 2 is the updated version. And again, they're on Audible, they're in Amazon. That's where people can get it.
Looking forward. So dear audience, I will include these links in the description of this little discussion here. David, I want to thank you so much. This was delightful to learn the practical ways of creating rituals in your company that, bring us to a common value system.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Oh, totally my pleasure, Thomas. Enjoy doing it.
This was excellent. Well, I want to thank you very much. I'll share your your contact information in the description, if that is okay.
Great. Absolutely.
And I look forward to seeing you in person in my other groups.
We'll look forward to that.
Thank you so much.